Okay, so we're back. It's hour 3. We've got, at least some of us have our Angular component kicking off and loading our HTML page. It's not showing any dynamic data yet. So now we need to start this chain of fetching the data and passing it along from one layer to the other. So I'm going to go into my server and controllers. We're going to make a new controller. And rather than call this controller games, I'm going to call it API. And we'll explain why in a minute. So make a new JavaScript file called API. And for the most part, this is going to look just like our kind of standard Express controllers. We'll require Express. And we'll create an instance of our Express router. Oops, sorry, I guess I do need my... Nothing new here. Let's also reference our model, because obviously our controller needs our model to talk to MongoDB. And at the end, we'll export it as we usually do. We'll take our Express router and make it public. Now, we could have copied our games controller from an earlier lesson, but I didn't want to use it because not only is it doing the CRUD operations, but it also has a whole bunch of res.render commands, which we don't want. This is a server file only now. It has nothing to do with our front end. In fact, it has no knowledge of the front end. And that's why we've actually called it API, because in effect, all this is a RESTful API. And I've had some questions from students before about, I've heard of REST API. What is it? Well, you're about to build one. So in a job interview, if they ask, do you know what a REST API is? Have you ever built one? You could say, yep, it's up on GitHub. Want to see it? Part of my mean stack with Angular 2 application. Okay. So we're still going to write methods here for doing create, read, update, and delete, but some of them are going to look a little different. So here's going to be our get all. We'll do a router.get. So we are going to use our model to query the database and fetch the list of games, and we'll get one of two things back, right? Either we get an error or we get a list of data. So on our game model, we call game.find. So this is the same so far as what we already had in our old games controller. So if we have an error, before we were calling res.render, right, and loading our error page. We're not going to do that in this case. We're just going to send back, return the error. In this case, we'll call res.send. We'll send the error. We'll also send along an HTTP status code. So 500 typically indicates any kind of 500 code is some kind of HTTP error or server error. So this is what happens if we, for some reason, our query fails in MongoDB. If our query doesn't fail, we're going to send back a response. What kind of response should we send back? Remember, we're building an API here. What format will our response be? So we'll call response.json. So we're simply sending back our response as a JSON object.
Do you have to use the JSON method because the data is actually coming as binary?
We could try just calling res.send.
I think it's also said that HTTP application type is application like JSON or another like UTF, like content type is application JSON.
Yeah, so we're probably safer if the client consuming it is expecting JSON, probably best to make sure we're calling res.json. So we've set this up. So we could try this now. If we go to localhost/API, okay, well, we've all seen this before. Nothing wrong with our controller. Why do we have a cannot get? What's missing? Yeah, we never called this controller. So our app.js, we make a new controller. We need to map that URL pattern to use our new controller. So in app.js, let's require it. Now it's available in app.js, and now we want to map with an app.use command. Any requests that come in at the route/API will be handled by this controller. So we've required it here. And right here, after we've mapped slash and users, so we browser, and once again try our localhost 3000/API. If it's working, what should happen? What do you expect we'll see? The cannot get should go away. Yeah, we should see if our query worked, we should see all of our game data rendered as JSON. So if I go to localhost 3000/API, there's our JSON. Now, something you may want to install. This is what it looks like for me in Chrome. If I do it here, I actually get this, which is way better. Now, by default, Firefox gives me the raw JSON as well. There are extensions for both Chrome and Firefox. So if you want to be able to view JSON data and format it properly, there's a Firefox extension you can install. It's tiny, it takes a second. In Chrome is the Chrome JSON viewer. There's a bunch of different extensions. You can install this, takes just a second. And then if you refresh your page, you don't have to install it, but it allows you to nicely format and expand and contract your JSON, as opposed to getting this, which is kind of hard to read. So those are just browser extensions you could use. Now, so there's our first method of our RESTful API. Right, we've written a get method that does exactly that, gets data. Now, what would be some reasons why we want to use this structure? That our controller has now become an API and is divorced from our front end. This does a few things. Chad, what do you think? We could use Ajax, but it wouldn't actually go here. It would probably be in our front end. We could do that, yes. What else does this do? By removing the user interface. So again, if we look here, this is just back-end code only. All it does is talk to the database, take a request and send JSON back based on a URL.
It makes it universal, so you can create an Android application that can connect the same API.
Right. This is now ignorant of, it's agnostic to what the user interface is. So our user interface is HTML and Angular 2, but our user interface could be Java compiled for Android, could be a Swift application compiled for iOS. So our backend code, we can now stick any kind of front end, can make calls to our API and access our data. So not only can we build different front ends and we don't have to change our back end, who else could access this back end now that we've made it a JSON API? Anybody, right? So we've got a game library. Somebody else wants to build a mobile app, a website, a database, something else, and they want access to our data. Well, all they have to do is now issue a GET request to our domain/API, and we're going to give them back a stream of JSON data, and they can consume, present, do whatever they want with that data. So we've made this totally scalable, and our server end and our client end, they're kind of two separate things. We will build our own client end, but we've also kind of multi-purposed this. So right now, all we can do is GET, but by the time we're done next week, we'll be able to, our API will do all of the CRUD operations, right? So think about this, right? We want video games in here, so we can say to a supplier, you know, we're selling games by Ubisoft. We can say, hey, every time you guys have a new game, if you want to put it in our store, just make a post request to our API and save it, and then we have it in our database. So there's no manual entry here, okay? If you want to look up what your games are selling for in our store, run a GET request and get the JSON. So it becomes this completely flexible, scalable architecture when we build this out as an API. So we've written our method here. So now we need a service method that will interact between our Express controller and our game component, and then our game component, which will actually render this stuff, send the data to our HTML. So we do need more layers. You might think, well, we're adding a lot of work. I mean, we didn't, you know, to get this working with Express and EJS, we just needed EJS here, and EJS and the controller talked, like, why have we added 2 more layers? Well, we're going to give the user a better experience by using Angular on the front end. They can manage all this stuff without having to reload the page. And it gives us the ability with our API to make this flexible, scalable, accessible to other applications. Doing more work to make it happen, but we get a much better product at the end, even if it kind of looks similar to an end user. So now we created this services folder. It's blank. We need to fix that. We need to create a game service. So the game service is the layer that sits between our Angular component and makes all of the requests to our server-side controller, issuing GET, POST, whatever kind of requests. So inside of services, we'll make a new TypeScript file, and we'll call it game.service. So we need a few dependencies here. One is we're making our service injectable. Oops. So this service could be added at runtime, or other dependencies can be added at runtime. They can be injected into our service if needed. We're also going to import HTTP. Why would we need HTTP here? We just wrote a get method in our server-side API controller.
Because the service connects to the component.
Right, the service is what will make the HTTP GET request to our controller. So we need that dependency so it can issue HTTP requests. Today, GET, next week, post, put, and delete. We also need, not this whole file, just this class. So this map TypeScript file, what this allows us to do is connect a response that comes back into our service and map it along our, kind of along our path. We need to say our service is injectable. We'll create a public class called game service. Similar to, we exported a public class called game component in our component. In order for other files to see this, we need to export it. So we need to create a special method called a constructor. We kind of may have talked about this a little bit in our C#. So a constructor is whenever our component creates an instance of our service. So a new service instance is created. So if we have 3 users requesting game libraries, each user will be creating an in-memory instance. We're going to create a constructor. And when that happens, our constructor needs HTTP library. Every time we invoke the service, we want to make some kind of HTTP calls to our express controller. Get, post, put, whatever HTTP method we want to run. So we'll write a function called getGames. So this is where our service will call our express controller. So we're going to use HTTP to issue a GET request. What will the URL be? Right, we're going to issue a GET request at /API. This is where we're going to use this little map function. So we're going to issue a GET request. What does that GET request return? Yeah, in what format? Yeah, we'll send us back a JSON object with our games. We're going to map that response as JSON. So our service goes here, gets the data, and then it hands that JSON object back to our component. So the service is really just the messenger. It's like the traffic cop. Do this in the back end, and then hand off whatever comes back to the front end. So this is just kind of like our messenger, our So now the last thing we need to do, well, we now need our component to call our service and call our getGames. Our getGames in the service calls our controller get, which gets our data and hands it back. So now let's go back to our game component. So we've written two get methods, one in Express, one in our service. We need one more in our component. And then our HTML calls get, which calls get, which calls get. And hands our data all the way back along the chain. So in our component, we're going to set up a games property, which is an array. We also need a constructor here. When an instance of our game component gets created, we also want to create in memory our service, because our component will use our service. Why is that red? Right? So we're trying to create an instance of our game service, but it doesn't know. So how do we fix this? Doesn't know what game service is. What do we need to do to define this file inside of this one? How do we make a reference to another file? Yeah, we just import it at the top. Again, we'll have to get the path right. Right there. So //services. Now our error goes away. Our component now knows what our game service is. So we'll write our third version of the get function. We'll set our array, our games array. To this dot game service. Okay, obviously we're missing something. So we created games as an array. We're instantiating an instance of our service. Whoops. We want to do it this way. Get games. What we want to do is use a method called subscribe. This allows us to attach on to the results of that call. So we're going to subscribe to the JSON response we get. So our component calls the get method in our service. it reads the response and sets up an array equal to the response we get back. So we've got 3 get methods. One here, one here, one here. If we go and check our page now, probably not going to see much. Yeah, why do we not get our table? Okay. It wrote this in here, which I don't want. Okay. The last thing we want to do is say whenever, as soon as the page loads, as soon as our component is created, we want to call get method. So it should load our list of games right away. There's still a couple. Obviously, we've got a little issue somewhere because our table disappeared, which isn't good. Our data's here. There's nothing wrong with our API. We know our server end is fine. Right? Our server can use our model, can fetch and display our data as JSON. So that's not our issue. I'm going to just check all of my references, see if there's anything we left out. Pardon?
You need to implement the service in the game component as a provider.
Thank you. That's what we missed. In our component declaration, we've referenced it, but we have to say the providers, good catch, ASAT, is our game service. So this is in effect providing data to our component. Okay, so that brings it back. So thank you for that. So we added this to our declaration. Now there's no data showing up yet because we haven't coded anything in our HTML. There's no Angular tags to actually show the data. Here, we're just not displaying it. So we just need to add some markup with some Angular directives in our game template. So I'll add a TR here. With an NG4. We used this last week when we were hard coding the games. So if we let game of games, this should create a new row now for every game. And now we can just use our mustache or handlebar syntax. We'll see now if our data shows up. So we used NG4 and we're displaying each game. I can put my buttons in here. They won't do anything yet. So I could put on a blue edit button and a red delete button, and we can deal with these next week. Those are weird. How did I wind up with that? Oh. Okay. So our API still works. We now just have an HTML and Angular front end consuming that JSON data. So where we want to go with this next week is we want to add a game form right on here. We should be able to add a new game and have it automatically appear at the bottom of our list with no reload. We can delete. We've already got our little jQuery confirmation, so we can add that class to our button. And if we delete a game, it just disappears. Again, no refresh. And if we edit, what we'll do is we'll click edit. We'll just pre-fill the form right here. And if we update, we'll save those changes back to MongoDB, refresh the list, clear out our form, our page never reloads. So the user only has to load this page one time. And then they can manage the data as much as they do whatever they want to with the data. Questions? If it seemed like this was a lot of work to set it all up, it was. Probably 80% of what we did today was just configuring things. Next week, we don't have to configure anything. We have to build an HTML form with 4 text boxes and a submit button. Then we need to write all of our methods, our API methods for doing post, put, and delete. So we'll need 3 functions here. We'll need the same functions in our service and in our component. So we should be able to do all those things much more quickly now that the application's configured to run. We did this the slow way. It would have been faster to use the Angular CLI, but I deliberately wanted to do it the slow way so that you saw step by step everything we would need to do. I also realized there's Angular classes or functions that are new and we haven't talked a lot about. There's only so much I can explain in 3 hours. All right. So I'm going to stop our broadcast for today. I'll push everything up to Git, and we'll resume with this next Wednesday.